The flames of the pagan altars illuminated the darkness of the night, and the cry of desperate mothers echoed through the streets of Jerusalem, a city considered holy. The man who ruled the nation had become the embodiment of cruelty. A king whose wickedness knew no bounds, who sacrificed his own son in pagan rituals and spilled so much innocent blood that the streets were stained red. He became the most relentless tyrant Israel had ever known, making suffering and death his trademark. But what happened next? The unexpected shook the kingdom in a way no one could have foreseen. How could the most cruel man in biblical history, responsible for such barbarism, suddenly become the greatest example of God's incomprehensible power of forgiveness? What led such a wicked king to transform into a living symbol of redemption? What happened for him to become, against all expectations, an example of mercy and divine transformation? Prepare to uncover the story of a transformation so deep and surprising that it defies any understanding of the power of divine forgiveness. King Hezekiah, one of the most just rulers Judah had ever known, found himself on his deathbed. His son, Manasseh, a boy of only 12 years, watched with fearful eyes as his father's life slowly faded away. The greatness of Hezekiah had illuminated the kingdom, which was now bidding farewell with tears, revering the king who had destroyed the pagan altars and restored true worship in Jerusalem. The lament filled everyone, but no one felt the loss as intensely as the young prince. With the death of Hezekiah, the crown, which had long been a symbol of wisdom and justice, was placed upon Manasseh's head. But it was a crown far too heavy for such a young and inexperienced boy. As soon as he ascended the throne, a strange atmosphere began to form around him. Sneaky-eyed advisors began circulating the palace, whispering tempting promises of power into the young king's ears. They spoke of ancient rituals, of foreign gods who, if worshipped, could grant him a strength greater than his father's. The temple priests watched in horror as Manasseh, day after day, unraveled the reforms his father had worked so hard to achieve. The climax of this dark transformation came when the young king issued his first official decree, the reconstruction of the pagan altars. This decision sent shockwaves throughout the kingdom, signaling the beginning of an era of darkness and perversity. Manasseh's transformation was swift and alarming. While religious leaders rose up against his actions, he found support among those who desired power and riches, those who believed the ancient foreign gods could bring them what they had always yearned for. A counselor from the northern lands, mysterious and of dubious intentions, became his closest ally, introducing the young king to increasingly darker practices. The palace, once a symbol of justice and worship of God, now became a center for occult rituals. At night, strange sounds echoed through the palace halls as the smoke of forbidden incense rose through the windows, transforming the sacred environment into a refuge for darkness. Manasseh, now thirsting for more power, had tasted the charms of evil and was willing to plunge even deeper into this abyss. But his most trusted counselor harbored a deadly secret. During the nights, he secretly met with emissaries from Assyria, revealing the kingdom's weaknesses and the deepest secrets of Jerusalem. Blinded by power, Manasseh failed to see that he was being manipulated by those he trusted most. His heart, once attuned to the worship of the God of his fathers, now hardened more and more against him. The city of Jerusalem, the holy city, which should have been a beacon of light to the nations, was now being consumed by the deepest darkness. And the worst was yet to come. Before continuing, if you believe no one is too far from God's love, leave a like and share your faith in the comments. Let's show the world that God's power is greater than any darkness. On a moonless night, when the shadows of the palace stretched long, Manasseh walked through the darkened halls, immersed in his own thoughts. But something made him stop, a presence that seemed to have emerged from nowhere. A figure appeared from the shadows, the old prophet Isaiah, who had once advised his father Hezekiah. Now, an elderly man, with hair as white as snow, but with eyes still burning with deep and unsettling wisdom. His eyes, fixed on the young king, radiated an intensity that was disturbing. "Son of Hezekiah," Isaiah's voice echoed through the empty halls, breaking the silence of the night. The cries of the innocent rise to the heavens. The Lord will not remain silent forever. The words, heavy with divine weight, penetrated Manasseh's soul, who, disturbed by the sudden appearance, ordered his guards to expel the prophet. But despite the impulsive gesture, Isaiah's words continued to resonate in his mind, a reminder that refused to be erased. That same night, while taking refuge in the depths of the ancient royal library, Manasseh came across the scrolls that recorded his father's reign. Those sacred texts spoke of miracles, of prayers answered, and of a nation thriving under divine blessing. His eyes ran over the ancient words, and for a moment, his hands trembled as he touched the writings that recounted Hezekiah's greatness. But soon Samael, the counselor of darkness, was at his side, whispering words of contempt. "Your father was weak. He settled for crumbs of power when he could have had it all," the counselor said, feeding Manasseh's rebellion against his father's legacy. With a gesture of anger, Manasseh ordered the scrolls to be locked away in the palace dungeons, removing them from the sight and memory of the kingdom. Yet signs that something was deeply wrong began to spread throughout Jerusalem. Falling stars streaked across the night sky, leaving trails like fiery tears. Strange omens whispered through the streets, warned of something sinister to come. And Isaiah the prophet continued to appear in unexpected ways, his warnings growing ever more urgent. But Manasseh, hardened by rage and power, closed his heart even more against the words of God's messenger. Manasseh's power reached its peak. The pagan altars he had ordered, rebuilt, now rose on every hill around Jerusalem, marking the dominion of darkness. His name was feared by neighboring nations, but instead of seeking to understand the cause of the many calamities that plagued his land, Manasseh convinced himself that the true enemy was within Jerusalem itself. "It is the followers of the God of my fathers who are to blame. They bring the curse upon our land," he declared furiously during a council meeting. "It is their prayers and their loyalty to the old God that keep the new gods from fully blessing us." Thus began a relentless persecution. Entire families who refused to participate in pagan rituals were driven from their homes, forced to abandon everything they had. The few faithful priests who remained, those who would not bow to Manasseh's power, were hunted like criminals. Some were thrown into the deepest dungeons, while others simply vanished in the night, leaving no trace behind. Manasseh's kingdom, once illuminated by the light of true worship, now sank deeper and deeper into darkness, and Jerusalem, once a beacon to the nations, became a land of shadows, filled with pain and despair. The lowest point came when, in his obsession with power and destruction, Manasseh ordered the construction of a new altar inside the very temple of Jerusalem. The sacred place, once dedicated to the one true God, was defiled with idols and pagan rituals. In the center of the Holy of Holies, where the divine presence once dwelled, a statue of a foreign deity was erected. At that moment, the earth shook violently, and dark clouds covered the sky as a direct warning from heaven. But instead of awakening, Manasseh remained blind, immersed in his madness, refusing to recognize the signs of God. Jerusalem, once known for its devotion and justice, was now a place of shadows and fear. The faithful, still resisting pagan practices, were forced to gather in caves and hidden places. Their prayers were accompanied by tears, a mixture of despair and hope for a divine intervention that seemed distant. But the worst was still to come. Manasseh's actions had drawn the attention of powers far beyond his comprehension. The price of his rebellion would be demanded in ways he could never have imagined. In his quest for even greater power, Manasseh turned his eyes toward the most feared empire of that time, Assyria. In a grand ceremony in the palace gardens, he received the Assyrian envoys, who brought not only promises of military alliance, but also rituals and practices even darker than the previous ones. The decision to ally with the Assyrians, renowned for their brutality and oppression, caused a deep division within Jerusalem's court. A group of nobles, led by Josiah, a distant cousin of the king, began to meet in secret. They watched in despair as the kingdom, once prosperous, was being destroyed not only by drought and calamities, but also by the madness of its ruler. "Our king has sold not only his soul, but the soul of the entire kingdom," Josiah whispered during one of those secret meetings held in the catacombs beneath the city. The cries of innocent blood rose to the heavens, but Manasseh, increasingly paranoid, responded to any shadow of opposition with brutality. He had planted spies in every corner of the kingdom, and soon rumors of a conspiracy reached his ears. His response was swift, relentless, and merciless. In a single night, dozens of nobles were arrested. Some were executed publicly, serving as a warning to all who dared challenge his authority. Others, less fortunate, vanished into the depths of the palace dungeons, their lives erased as though they had never existed. The kingdom, already plunged into spiritual and political darkness, grew ever more distant from any hope of redemption. Manasseh's power seemed unshakable, yet the price of his rebellion was mounting, and divine justice was drawing near, silent and relentless. Josiah barely escaped. Fleeing into the desert with a small group of followers, he left behind the city that had once been the heart of his people. But as Josiah withdrew, Jerusalem's darkness deepened. During a particularly grim ritual, Manasseh, immersed in his pagan practices, stumbled upon a prophecy. Amid the smoke of exotic incense and the chanting of dark hymns, an ancient and terrible voice echoed through the throne room. "The king who abandons his God shall be abandoned by his power. In chains he will be taken, and in tears he shall return." The prophecy shook Manasseh more than he wished to admit. His nightmares, once fragments of a disturbed mind, became vivid and relentless. He saw chains and captivity, the inevitability of his downfall looming like a shadow. The paranoia that already consumed him now ruled him entirely. He began to see traitors in every shadow, conspiracies in every whisper. His most loyal counselor, Samael, tried to soothe his fears, insisting the prophecy was nothing more than empty words. "With our combined power, my lord, no prophecy can stop us," he said, attempting to quiet the king's doubts. But fate, as always, had other plans. One stormy night, a group of assassins infiltrated the palace, and Manasseh's nightmare came true. When they reached the royal chambers, they found Samael standing guard. In the fight that followed, Samael, whether out of loyalty or guilt, sacrificed himself to protect the king. He fell, pierced by multiple blades, as the assassins carried out their deadly mission. Samael's death pushed Manasseh further into the abyss of madness. Completely paranoid, the king ordered the construction of a secret network of tunnels beneath the palace, passages only he knew. His decrees grew more erratic and cruel. Anyone who dared question his authority was branded a traitor. Manasseh began sleeping in a different chamber each night, surrounded by guards and fortified with pagan amulets. His obsession with spiritual protection drove him deeper into forbidden rituals. The stench of incense and sacrifice never left the palace. The screams that echoed in the night made the people of Jerusalem tremble in their beds, yet the prophecy still echoed in the king's mind, a shadow no amount of power could silence. Unbeknownst to him, the gears of destiny were already in motion, and his fall would be even more spectacular than his rise to the throne of darkness. Now more than ever, Manasseh was a prisoner of his own choices, blind to the fact that the true enemy was closer than he imagined. Betrayal came like lightning from a clear sky. The Assyrians, whom he had trusted as allies, revealed their true nature during a banquet in the royal palace. In the midst of celebration, Assyrian guards emerged from the shadows, swords drawn. The king, who had allied himself with foreign powers for so long, now found himself ensnared by his own web of deceit. Bound like an animal, Manasseh was dragged through the streets of Jerusalem before the eyes of his people. The same people he had terrorized for years now watched in silence as he was humiliated. The shackles on his wrists were bronze, but the weight upon his soul was far heavier. Manasseh, who once possessed everything, power, wealth, a submissive nation, was now reduced to nothing, a hollow shadow of his unbridled ambition. The reign of darkness he had built with such fervor was collapsing, and public humiliation was the price of his rebellion against God. In the darkness of his cell in Babylon, surrounded by the stench of dampness and the oppressive silence of cold stone walls, Manasseh was left alone with his memories. There, in exile, far from the glory he once flaunted, echoes of the past resurfaced like shadows that refused to fade. Memories of his childhood, long buried beneath layers of pride and cruelty, now rose like bubbles in murky water. He remembered his father's morning prayers, the sound of voices lifted to the God of Abraham, the God who had promised protection and mercy to his people. Stories of deliverance came back to him, of covenants of faithfulness, of songs that once filled the royal house of Jerusalem when he was still a child. And each memory was like an arrow piercing his hardened heart. During the long days of captivity, travelers brought reports of the situation in his land. Each word was a wound reopened, the temple he had desecrated now in ruins, families torn apart by the persecution he had ordered, the holy city, destined for light, submerged in darkness and suffering. The weight of guilt crushed him night after night. Lying on the cold floor of his cell, he relived each decision, each act of cruelty, every time he had chosen power over justice. The tears that had long dried in his hardened soul now flowed freely. It was in this state of deep despair that something unexpected happened. Some priests, those who had managed to escape his fury and find refuge in Babylon, began visiting him in secret. Manasseh, expecting words of condemnation or perhaps the silence of contempt, received from them something entirely different: words of hope, messages of forgiveness. They saw in his pain not just a punishment, but an opportunity for redemption. Redemption that seemed impossible in the eyes of men, but not in the eyes of God. In the solitude of his cell, Manasseh faced his greatest enemy, himself. The voices of darkness still whispered to him, offering power, vengeance, and the promise of reclaiming his former glory. But now he saw clearly the emptiness of these illusions, until one night, in a terrible nightmare, where he relived every scream, every tear, every pain caused by his tyranny, something inside him broke. Stripped of all pride, he fell to his knees. For the first time in decades, he lifted his voice not to idols, but to the God of his fathers. His prayer was not a request for liberation, but a cry of sincere repentance. "Lord," he whispered through his tears, "I have sinned more grievously than all who came before me. The blood of the innocent stains my hands, and the darkness I allowed in your holy temple cries out for justice. I do not deserve forgiveness, but I beg for your mercy." And the unfathomable happened. After years of captivity, when nothing seemed possible, Manasseh was freed. He did not return to Jerusalem as a triumphant king, surrounded by trumpets and armies, but as a broken man, carrying in his heart not the pride of royalty, but the weight of grace received. His first act was not to raise walls or sit on thrones, but to order the destruction of all the pagan altars he had built. With his own hands, he participated in the tearing down of the statues. Each strike against the idols was more than a physical act. It was a cry for liberation, a declaration of war against the darkness he had embraced for so long. And so, the man who had plunged Israel into darkness began, at last, to lift his eyes toward the light. The rebuilding of Jerusalem was not simple. The wounds left by Manasseh's previous reign were too deep to disappear quickly, and many looked at him with suspicion, fearing that his change was merely a disguise. But unlike the proud and ruthless man he had once been, Manasseh now persevered with humility. Day by day, he worked not only to restore the walls and temples that had been destroyed, but, above all, to rebuild the faith of a people torn apart by idolatry and injustice. He sought neither glory nor recognition. On the contrary, his actions were silent and consistent. He established new laws that ensured the people's freedom to worship the true God without fear, and dedicated resources to support the families he had harmed in the past. Each act of restitution was a living confession of his sins and, at the same time, a proof of the sincerity of his transformation. The streets of Jerusalem, which had once echoed with cries of suffering, again filled with praise. On Shabbat nights, the sacred songs could once again be heard, rising like incense before the throne of the Most High. The temple, purified of corruption, became once again the spiritual heart of the nation. The end of Manasseh's life was marked by humility and continuous repentance. He never tried to justify or erase his past crimes, but dedicated each day to repairing what was within his reach. His story became a living testimony to the transformative power of divine forgiveness, showing that even the most corrupt heart can be reached by God's light. When he finally departed from this life, he was not buried with the grandeur of a powerful king, but with the dignity of a redeemed man. His memory remained as an eternal reminder: there is no sin so great that God's mercy cannot forgive, nor darkness so dense that divine light cannot dissipate. The scars of his reign never completely disappeared from the holy city, but his story of redemption continued to inspire generations. It stood as proof that even in the deepest valley of darkness, there is always a path back to the light, if there is true repentance. And so, Manasseh's life echoes to this day as a message of hope and restoration. If this story touched your heart, leave a like as an act of gratitude to God. May the Lord bless you, and see you soon.